My name is Joan Merrick. I am 71 years old, a widow, and the woman behind Merrick Hospitality, a collection of resorts my late husband Martin and I built over 40 years, stone by stone, dream by dream. Most people don't know my name. They know the resorts, the oceanfront suites, the shimmering ballrooms, the polished marble floors. That's fine. I was never one to stand in the spotlight. I believe the work should speak for itself, but nothing prepares you for when your own family decides you are no longer part of the picture. Weeks before my son Evan's wedding, my phone buzzed. I was at the kitchen table pouring chamomile tea into a porcelain cup with a thin crack along the handle. That cup has been with me for decades, carrying mornings, grief, and memory. As steam curled upward, my phone lit up. The message glowed on the screen, from Sloan, my future daughter-in-law. "We don't need you there." 7 words, no explanation, no apology, not even a punctuation mark softening the blow. The words pressed down heavier than the steam in my cup. My hand trembled, not from age, but from recognition. It wasn't sudden. It had been coming. The way Sloan looked at me like a prop from another era. The way she called me Joan instead of Mom, as though intimacy was an outdated accessory. Before I could steady my breath, the phone rang. The name on the screen, Paige, the wedding planner. Her voice was brisk, polished, every syllable practiced. "Mrs. Merrick, I just wanted to confirm the $80,000 deposit has gone through. The couple decided on the grand Juniper Ballroom for the ceremony. It's one of our premier packages. Congratulations again." I sat there in silence. My finger traced the crack in my cup. She continued cheerfully, "It's wonderful, really." The couple said it was easier since the card was already on file. They used your card to put down the $80,000 deposit at the Juniper Bay Resort. Juniper Bay? My resort. The one Martin and I dreamed into being when we were barely older than Evan is now. $80 million of legacy. $80 million of quiet love disguised as architecture and service. I let her words hang in the air. Then I smiled. Not kindly, not bitterly, just the way a tide recedes before pulling back with force. "Cancel it all," I said. Paige stuttered. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not family." "You can't make that decision." My voice stayed soft. "No, I'm the one who owns the $80 million resort you booked, the catering you hired, and the hotel where your guests plan to stay." The silence on the line was different this time, heavy, startled. Sloan had erased me from her wedding. I erased her wedding from existence. She cut me out. I cut her off. I placed the phone down, slowly, carefully, beside the cracked cup. Outside, the garden wind stirred the rosemary. My reflection in the glass looked calm, almost serene. Because this wasn't rage, it was clarity. You spend your lifetime being the root, the foundation, the steady hands behind the curtains. People forget. They think the show runs itself. But without the foundation, there is no house. Without the root, no bloom. And without me, there would be no wedding at all. And maybe, as you're listening now, you've felt it too. The moment you realized you were no longer invited to the table you set, to the life you built. It cuts deeper than anger, but sometimes the most powerful answer isn't shouting. It's silence, and one steady act. If you've ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or quietly erased, I want you to stay with me. This story isn't just about loss. It's about reclaiming dignity, choosing peace over noise, and discovering that even at 71, it's never too late to begin again. So before I take you further, let me ask, where are you listening from tonight? Tell me. Let's sit together, across miles and screens, as I share what happened after that message, the unraveling of a wedding, a family, and the quiet rebirth of a woman they thought was disposable. The night after that message, I sat alone in my kitchen, the silence pressing against me like an old quilt too heavy to lift. My hands cupped the cracked porcelain, steam fading. Outside, The garden lights blinked on one by one, but my mind drifted backward, decades back, to a very different kind of light. It was the golden hue of late summer when I first met Martin. I was 23, working at the front desk of a run-down boarding house near the lake. The ceiling leaked when it rained, the wallpaper curled at the corners, and the carpet smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many times we scrubbed. I told myself it was temporary, a job until something better arrived. Then one afternoon he walked in, carrying a hammer, a roll of roofing tar, and a carpenter's pencil behind his ear. He smiled, not wide, not showy, but steady. "Where should I start?" he asked. His voice was low, even, certain. I pointed to the roof. He nodded, and just like that, the quiet rhythm of my life shifted. The image is still vivid. Martin on the ladder, sun at his back, hands strong and sure as he pressed new shingles into place. Inside, I folded table linens with aching fingers, watching dust fall through slanted light. His hands fixed the leaks above while mine tried to make beauty out of threadbare cloth. 2 sets of hands, 2 small acts of care. Looking back now, that was the beginning. He came down from the roof hours later, sweat darkening his shirt. I expected him to leave without a word, like every other workman had. Instead, he walked over to the front desk where I sat, tired but curious. He tapped the carpenter's pencil against the ledger. "This place could shine," he said, "if someone loved it enough." I laughed softly. "It's held together with string and luck." He looked at me with a gaze that didn't flinch. "Then maybe it just needs steadier hands." Didn't know then that he meant both the inn and me. We married a year later in the garden behind that broken house. There were wild lavender bushes, a hose that never worked, and folding chairs borrowed from the local church. Nothing about it was glamorous, but I wore a simple cream dress, and Martin's hands were steady when he promised, "We'll build something that lasts." A place where people come not just to stay, but to start over. That was his dream, to create a place where new beginnings could take root. At first, it was just the 2 of us. He patched roofs and painted walls while I cooked meals in the kitchen and greeted the rare guests who wandered in. We had 1 piano with 2 broken keys, 1 dining table with wobbling legs, and 12 rooms that smelled faintly of damp cedar. Still, Martin spoke of the future as if it already existed. "Imagine," he whispered one night, his arm draped across my shoulders, both of us staring at the waterline. "A resort by the ocean. Glass windows so wide you see the sunrise from your bed, a ballroom for weddings, anniversaries, beginnings. We'll call it Juniper Bay." I leaned my head against him. "And who will run this grand dream?" "You will," he said simply, "because no one sees people the way you do." I thought he exaggerated, but he meant it. Years stretched, and slowly the dream became brick, mortar, and light. The boarding house turned profitable, then expanded into 3 cottages by the lake. By the time Evan was born, we owned 4 properties. By his high school graduation, we had 16. Each one carried Martin's touch. Wood beams chosen for their grain, stone paths curved like sentences, gardens planted with rosemary and lavender. My touch was quieter. Folded linens, menus that felt like comfort, letters sent to guests who lost loved ones, reminding them they still had a place to belong. We built not just walls, but memory. Martin never chased profit. He chased permanence. "If you build with heart," he told me again and again, "the money will follow. If you chase money, you'll always be hollow." He was right. By our 30th anniversary, Juniper Bay Resort rose from the shoreline like a promise fulfilled. Its chandeliers once hung in Austrian estates, its marble floors imported from Tuscany, but its soul was stitched from the laughter of guests who danced, healed, and began again beneath its roof. $80 million, they say now. That's what Juniper Bay is worth. But Martin never measured worth in numbers. He measured it in the way a child's eyes widened at the sight of the ocean, in the way a widow breathed easier after a week of rest, in the way couples renewed their vows beneath the vaulted ceilings. We built more resorts, 30 then 40, but Juniper Bay remained the heart. It was where Martin and I sat late into the night with ledgers open, where we argued over wallpaper patterns, where we laughed until our ribs ached about guests who smuggled raccoons into rooms. It was where Evan took his first steps, toddling down the ballroom's empty floor. And it was where Martin placed his hand over mine and said with quiet certainty, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll protect this. Not just the business, the soul of it. Promise me." I promised. 3 winters ago, Martin passed suddenly in his sleep. A heart attack, no pain, just silence. One moment he was drinking chamomile tea by the fire, the next he was gone. The hardest silence of my life. I honored the promise. I kept everything in my name, not from greed, but from reverence. Because what we built was more than profit margins. It was a living testimony of our love and our labor. Now, as I sit in the kitchen decades later, the glow of my phone screen still seared into memory, I realize how quickly others forget the roots. Sloan thought I was a guest to be managed, a line item to be erased. She forgot, or never cared, that every brick she walked on was once carried by my husband's hands, every chandelier polished by mine. Martin dreamed of a place for new beginnings. Tonight, his dream might just be my weapon. My husband died on a Thursday in winter, the kind of cold that turns breath into lace. The night before, we sat by the fire, chamomile steaming in our cracked porcelain cups, going over a delivery schedule for the South Wing. He said he was tired. He set the cheffer on the ledger, capped, centered, just so. He kissed my forehead and went to bed first. I washed the cups, turned off the lamps, and followed the soft line of his breathing down the hallway. At dawn, the house felt wrong. The radiator ticked. The kettle on the stove whistled off tempo, a thin, breathless wheeze that wouldn't resolve. I carried a mug to our room and found the quilt perfectly smooth on his side, as if a hotel maid had pressed it with an iron no one ordered. When I reached for his shoulder, my hand met stillness, a quiet so complete it answered every question, and left one. I called 911. I unlocked the front door. I sat on the edge of the bed and counted the knots in the pine floor, because numbers felt safer than names. By the time the ambulance lights threw red against the ceiling, my breath had settled into the kind of calm that arrives when the world has already decided for you. I answered questions. I signed papers. I was offered water by a young paramedic whose freckles made him look like a boy. He said he was sorry, and I believed him. What I remember most from that morning is the sound the zipper made on the black bag, coarse, patient, almost courteous. Grief did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like snow, quiet, accumulating, refusing to melt when the sun came out. I folded Martin's robe over my arm, touched the shallow dent his head left in the pillow, and stood very still because moving felt like breaking something that had not yet fallen apart. In the days after, the house learned my new silence. I boiled water out of habit and forgot the tea leaves. I set 2 plates, then put 1 back. I kept finding the cheffer in places it didn't belong, the nightstand, the kitchen counter, the pocket of my cardigan, as if the pen itself refused to accept being left alone. On the 3rd day, I wiped it clean, polished the nib with the corner of a dish towel, and placed it in the top drawer of Martin's desk. I turned the key. The small click sounded like a vow. The funeral took place on a gray afternoon that smelled faintly of rain and lilies. We filled the chapel Martin had restored for a holiday concert one winter, back when he believed any room could be repurposed for joy. I stood at the podium with my notes, paragraphs written in tidy lines, details chosen carefully, his carpenter's pencil, his quiet laugh, the way he steadied a ladder with one hand and my elbow with the other. I began to read. My son sat in the 2nd row. Evan's head was bowed, but his hand was in his pocket, closing around his phone like a lifeline. It vibrated once, then again. He glanced at the screen, then at Sloane beside him. Red lipstick, perfect hair, eyes scanning the room as if we were at a gala and she needed to find the photographer. The phone vibrated a third time. Evan rose quietly and stepped into the aisle. The door sighed as it opened. Cold air crept in. I kept reading. I told the room about the time Martin hammered a nail with the bottom of a mug because all the hammers were locked in a truck half a mile away. I told them how he used to fix leaky faucets for guests without charging them, how he remembered names even when budgets blurred. I did not mention the way my throat felt like a fist. I did not mention the loneliness that had already begun to measure the room. When the service ended, people hugged me with careful arms. They said beautiful things about Martin, and some of them were even true. After the reception, after the lilies and sandwiches and the paper cups of weak coffee, I went home and stood in our bedroom doorway. The bed looked staged for a photograph. The quilt was smooth, the pillows aligned, the indentation on his side almost vanished. I sat where his weight used to live and pressed my palm to the sheet as if warmth could be summoned back by will. I slept that night facing the empty space, as if keeping watch. The radiator ticked its small metronome. The kettle, again, whistled off tempo. In the morning, I wrote his name in my planner as if it were an appointment I could keep. Call Martin, 10 a.m., then drew a line through it so straight it hurt. I opened the desk, checked the drawer, and touched the key. The pen waited inside like a heartbeat, paused but not gone. Responsibility is a quiet animal. Memory is its twin. I fed both, carefully. At first, the exclusions arrived dressed as manners. We met for Thursday dinners, a habit Evan promised to keep after moving in with Sloane. The bistro laid white paper over battered wood. Water glasses sweated small. Weather systems. Evan talked construction timelines. Sloane scrolled photos of champagne-colored centerpieces and said elevated the way a weather report says clear. When the server asked, "Anything else for you, Mom?" Sloane answered for me without looking up. "Joe's fine." Joe. The first time, I thought I misheard. The second time, I smiled because smiling costs less than correction. The third time, I understood. It was not a nickname. It was a border. Mom was a role. Joe was a guest. Evan didn't notice or pretended not to. He stirred ice in his glass until the cubes clattered. One evening, I brought a velvet box that creaked softly when opened. Inside lay my grandmother's sapphire earrings, midnight stones and prongs, passed down through 3 women who believed beauty should be something you carry, not something that carries you away. I set the box between salt and pepper, a tiny ceremony on a paper tablecloth. "For you," I said to Sloane, turning the lid toward her. "I saved them for the woman Evan would marry." She leaned in. Candlelight sank into blue and came back deeper. She lifted her phone, framed a picture, and nodded as if approving a prop. "They're lovely," she said, and then, gentle, perfectly rehearsed, "but they're not the vibe." Not the vibe. She closed the lid like a quiet dismissal and slid the heirloom back toward me. The server arrived with bread, and the moment dissolved into olive oil. Evan cleared his throat, told me about a gym he might join, and I studied his face for the boy who once lifted his arms for me to carry him upstairs, drunk on the simple fact of being chosen. Driving home, night pressed the windshield flat. I buckled the velvet box into the passenger seat as if stones could bruise. At a red light, my reflection floated in the glass. The woman people call gracious when they mean quiet. I thought of my grandmother fastening those sapphires before church, how they made her stand straighter, as if remembrance had weight. I wondered about handing a legacy to someone who prefers a mood board. The next Thursday, the centerpieces were white hydrangeas, like clouds. Sloane arrived late, a lateness that expects applause. She kissed Evan and offered me a tilted cheek. "Joe," she said, "I asked the florist about peonies. They're trending again." She showed photos of bouquets combed into perfection. I remembered a different cloud, A summer when Evan was 10, jersey too big, the number peeling. His team lost by 9. He stood behind the dugout trying not to cry, cheeks blotched, shoulders small. We could have gone home, but he climbed onto the back of my bike for the long ride to the corner stand. He held my waist with damp hands. I felt the heat of his back through my shirt, the way a storm holds the air even after it passes. At the window, he chose lemon ice. I paid and watched his shoulders lift. Memory is a generous thief. It steals your breath and offers you back a reason. I returned to the table to find Sloan planning a content wall. Spontaneous photos on schedule. Evan nodded, trained. He drank my water without looking. Such a small thing, and yet the intimacy of old habits had become absent-mindedness. Later that week, she sent a seating chart for my awareness. My name appeared as Evan's guest, not mother of the groom. A tiny demotion, neat as a label maker, cold and precise. In the group thread, she titled, Vendors Only. She added me by mistake, then removed me with a bubble that read, Cleaning up participants. No malice in the wording, only Windex. I tried to love them in their language. I sent a florist contact I trusted, suggested a jazz trio, offered to proofread the seating chart. Each offer met a velvet number. We've got a team, Sloan said. It'll be easier if you enjoy and let us handle. Enjoy. Handle. Words that turn love into logistics. When I couldn't sleep, I walked the hall and paused at Evan's old room. His baseball glove still hung from a nail, leather darkened by summers. The window overlooked the driveway where he learned to ride without training wheels, falling twice, insisting on a third because I promised to be the ground. I stood there and wondered when usefulness had replaced presence, when funding had replaced belonging. Another dinner, another white tablecloth, pretending to be linen. Sloan's phone pulsed with messages titled, Brand as Palette, Deliverables. Evan laughed at something I didn't hear. When the server asked about dessert, Sloan waved it away. Jo is watching her sugar, she said. She's so disciplined. My mouth watered for lemon tart I hadn't ordered. I pictured a slice bright as noon, placed without debate, because someone remembered what I loved. Evan walked me to the curb. The marina smelled like coins and salt. He kissed my cheek. Don't worry about the wedding, he said. Sloan's got it. I nodded. He looked relieved, as if I'd signed a form. I held his face between my hands the way I used to when checking for fever. Do you? I asked. He didn't answer. He pressed my fingers and stepped back to where her silhouette waited, already turned, posing for a future without me. The exclusions gathered like lint, soft, persistent, everywhere. Not cruel, not exactly, just cumulative. And one morning, they stopped being manners and revealed themselves as math. I opened the bottom drawer of Martin's desk with the deliberate grace of ritual. The wood groaned softly as if mourning being touched by only one pair of hands now. Beneath the neatly arranged file folders lay the Sheffer pen he'd used for everything from grocery lists to multi-million-dollar contracts. Black lacquer, gold trim, initials worn faint near the clip. It was still warm from memory. I lifted it out and laid it gently on the table like a relic. That pen had signed mortgage approvals, birth certificates, charitable grants, and once, a lopsided note for me that said, Gone to pick up soup. Love you more than chowder today. It would sign an ending. By the time Marion arrived, the afternoon sun had lost its arrogance. It poured through the tall windows in strips, catching dust motes like fading stars. Marion was older than me by perhaps 5 years, but carried herself like time was something she had tamed, not endured. Her silver hair was pulled into a knot so tight it could have cracked granite. Her eyes, sharp, unblinking, had been both sword and shield for Martin's legacy for over 2 decades. She entered without announcing herself. You sure about this? She said, already setting her briefcase down. No greeting, no tea. Just the scent of cedar and paper and something unspoken. I nodded once quietly. They booked the resort using my card. Marion's eyebrow twitched, barely. Without permission? A silent assumption, I said, which is worse. We sat across from each other like two queens at war, one with papers, one with patience. Between us lay contracts thick with decades of goodwill, maintenance schedules, land deeds, vendor agreements, all tied to my name, my credit, my late husband's dreams, and lately, my silence. I can file for fraud, she offered, sliding over a form, or make it a breach of agreement, or just revoke authorization. Your call. I don't want headlines, I replied. No spectacle, no fire. Marion removed her glasses. Then what do you want? To reclaim what was mine, I said, without asking. She paused. That was enough. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind women of our age know too well, the silence of decisions made long ago finally catching up. Marion didn't press. She never had. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out a smaller folder, labeled in my handwriting. Your instructions, she said. Still good? She asked. Still mine, I answered. Together, we reviewed the documentation that transferred the reservation account into my personal holding trust, the one Sloan never asked about, the one Evan forgot existed. I crossed my T's, dotted my I's. Then Marion passed me the final document. She placed a crimson wax seal beside the signature line, the kind Martin insisted on for every significant agreement. I held the Sheffer pen between my fingers. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe my hands were steadier now. Either way, I signed my name with the calmness of an ocean before a storm. Marion lit the wax, and the flame flickered as if deciding whether to cooperate. Then she pressed the stamp down. A red circle bled onto the page, sealing the revocation. It looked like a drop of blood, only colder. She'll find out, Marion said, not unkindly. I pushed the signed paper forward. She already did. I stood, smoothing the hem of my sweater, surprised to feel no trembling in my knees, no guilt, no fear, just quiet. For years, I'd let my identity be a series of gentle surrenders. Wife, mother, widow, investor. Always adapting, always accommodating. But today I wasn't adapting. I wasn't asking. I was reclaiming. Marion collected the papers and tucked them away. Anything else? Yes, I said, turning toward the window. Can you have the staff prepare the garden terrace for a private dinner? Just one table. For how many? Just me, I said. And Martin? She understood. She always did. When she left, I lingered by the table, brushing my fingertips along the edge of the pen one last time before returning it to the drawer. Not because I was done, but because I'd finally begun. When Marion closed her briefcase, I thought she would leave, but she lingered. Maybe she sensed I wasn't done, or maybe she wasn't ready to go either. The silence between us was gentle, the way it is between women who have both buried men they once loved and built things no one saw them build. I looked out at the garden beyond the office window. The trees swayed just slightly, as if the world was exhaling something it had held in too long. Then I spoke. Don't release the ballroom back to the public, I said, my voice soft but sure. I want it used. Marion raised an eyebrow. Used? How? I turned toward her, and for the first time all day, I felt warmth in the center of my chest. Let's give that reservation to someone who would never dream of asking for it. A flicker crossed her face. Curiosity, then understanding, then something like pride. Who? I said the name without hesitation. Rosa Santiago. Marion leaned back, clearly surprised. Maria's daughter. I nodded. She's getting married next month. I saw the notice in the back office bulletin board. She was saving up to host something small at a community hall. Marion blinked. You want to give her the ballroom meant for your son's wedding? No, I said. I want to give her the ballroom meant for my son's wedding. Her eyes softened. Does Rosa even know? She will. I remember the first time I saw Rosa. She couldn't have been more than 5, trailing behind her mother, Maria, with a tiny pink backpack and a stuffed monkey whose tail had come unstitched. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was checking room 212 after a last-minute repair. Maria was scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain on the windowsill, while Rosa stood on tiptoe, smearing condensation across the glass with her fingertips, making cloud patterns. I had walked in, holding a bouquet of guest thank you cards when I caught Rosa's reflection. She looked up, startled, then grinned with the unfiltered joy only children have. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a cotton candy stick from the hotel gift shop. "Have you ever tried this?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She shook her head. "It's spun sugar," I whispered, "just like fairy tales." She took it with both hands like it was made of glass. I leaned in and said, "One day, sweetheart, you'll walk through this place like a princess." You'll see Maria had paused her scrubbing. Her eyes were wet. "Thank you, Mrs. Merrick," she said, her voice thick. I never forgot that day, not because of the candy or the smile or even the words, but because Rosa looked at that lobby like it was a palace, and I never wanted her to forget it could be. Now Rosa stood across from me in the garden terrace, her hands nervously clasped in front of her, wearing a simple cream dress stitched with hand-embroidered vines. She had grown into a woman with gentle posture and eyes that still carried the weight of watching her mother clean luxury rooms that had never belonged to them. "I don't understand," she said softly. "You want to give me the ballroom?" I nodded. "But I can't afford it. I mean, not even close. I was just going to have our vows in the church hall. We already printed the invites." I reached for her hands. "It's not about what you can afford, Rosa. It's about what you deserve." She blinked, lips parting. I never thought I'd have a chance to even be in that room, let alone marry there. I smiled and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The first day I came to this resort, it wasn't even a resort yet. It was a forgotten building with termites and broken windows, but I saw something in it, something worth restoring. Her eyes welled. "And now, Rosa," I said, "on your first day as a wife, I want you to step into the same room I once stepped into and see it not as a maid's daughter, but as a woman becoming something new." She choked out a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," I said, "by becoming everything your mother hoped you'd be." That evening, I stood alone in the grand ballroom. The lights were dimmed, but not off. A golden haze painted the parquet floor. The air held no music, but it felt like something was playing in the silence. Something gentle, like strings tuning before the first note. Rosa had gone to prepare. The staff would come tomorrow to reset the tables, but tonight it was just me. I ran my fingers along the edge of the wooden door, the one Martin and I sanded ourselves years ago when this place still smelled like sawdust and ambition. Behind me, light from the stained glass window washed over the floor in soft blues and reds. I closed my eyes, imagining Rosa standing there in a dress her mother might have sewn, her groom waiting at the altar, the scent of jasmine and garden roses in the air, and laughter that healed things no apology ever could. She would walk through those doors not because someone opened them for her, but because she had earned her own key. And in that quiet room, I whispered, "Let her have her beginning." The knock at the door came just after sundown, not hurried, not hesitant, just tired. I opened it to find Evan standing there, a navy ball cap in his hand, the brim already bent out of shape from being twisted over and over between his fingers. He looked smaller than I remembered. The porch light cut shadows across his face, aging him in a way time hadn't yet. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, then quickly dropped. "Hi, Mom," he said. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked in, his shoulders tight, his footsteps soft on the old hardwood floor. We sat in the kitchen, the same place I'd once set out dinosaur-shaped pancakes for him before school. He didn't touch the tea I poured, just stared into his lap, cap still in hand. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "you finally decided to speak to me." Evan winced. I didn't know how to start. "How about, I'm sorry I let my fiancé cut you out of our wedding, then used your credit card without your knowledge." He flinched. It wasn't supposed to go like that. "No?" I leaned in. "Tell me, Evan." "How was it supposed to go?" He sighed, setting the cap on the table. "We were overwhelmed. The planning got out of hand. Sloan wanted it perfect and—" "Perfect," I echoed. "Is that what they call betrayal now?" His mouth opened, then shut. He reached for his tea, then thought better of it. His hands trembled slightly. "I just wanted it all to be simple," he muttered. "Simple," I said, voice sharp as porcelain cracking. "Simple is erasing your mother from the guest list. Simple is charging $80,000 on a card tied to the resort her and your father built with their bare hands. Simple is saying nothing while the woman you love tells me I'm not family." Evan's face fell. "She didn't mean it like that." "But she said it like that," I cut in, "and you stood by." He buried his face in his hands. I didn't know what to say. "You don't have to say anything, Evan," I said. "You already chose." A heavy silence followed. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered. "But you did," I said quietly, "and you kept doing it. Not just this month, or with the wedding. It's been years of letting her talk over me, correcting me in front of guests, telling me my traditions were outdated, calling me Joe." I stood up slowly, my knees stiff but steady. "I gave you everything I had. I held you when your father died. I signed the papers when you went to college out of state, even though I knew I'd be alone in that big house. And when you brought her home and told me she made you feel seen, I smiled and said I was happy for you." He looked up, eyes glassy. "You always wanted more," I continued. "More space, more say, more silence from me. Well, you've got it now." He opened his mouth again, then closed it. There was nothing to defend. He knew that, and I think, in some corner of his soul, he'd known it for a long time. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "I mean it." I nodded. "I know you do." He stood slowly, cap in hand again. He took a step toward me. "I'll talk to Sloan," he said. "Try to make things right." "No," I said gently. "Don't talk to her for me. Don't defend me like a guilty afterthought. You either choose the kind of man your father was or you don't. That's not something I can fix." He nodded, eyes brimming. As he walked to the door, he turned once more. "I do love you, Mom." I smiled, but there was sorrow in it. "Then you better learn how to love someone with a backbone." And with that, I watched my son disappear into the dusk, the same way fog rolls out over the ocean, slow, inevitable, and strangely beautiful in its undoing. The call came just after 8. I was drying the last of the dinner plates, the tea towel soft and worn in my hands. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes like it was trying to get in. I recognized the number before I picked up. Sloan. I let it ring twice more before answering. I didn't say hello. Her voice came sharp, clipped. "You really went through with it." I didn't respond. I folded the towel, set it neatly on the counter. "You canceled the entire reservation without telling us," she said, tone rising. "Evan had to find out from the planner." "The invitations were printed. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd helped Evan with his algebra, where Martin once repaired a broken chair leg without a word. "I did exactly what needed to be done," I said, voice level. Sloan scoffed. "This is exactly why I didn't want you there." Now you always have to be in control. I looked down at the cup of tea I hadn't touched, a delicate porcelain one, glazed white with a faint blue rim. One of the older pieces in my cabinet. A small crack ran from the lip to the base, not wide enough to leak, just enough to show it had survived something. "You know," I said softly, "this teacup has a hairline fracture. It's been there for years, but it still holds warmth, still serves its purpose." Quietly, with grace. She went silent. "It's not shiny," I continued. "It's not new, but it's real. Not like something glossy and hollow. Pretty to look at, maybe, but it doesn't hold anything." I heard her exhale, sharp. "You're always talking in riddles." Always trying to sound wise. "No," I said, still calm. "I'm just tired of being spoken over. You don't have to understand what I say, but you do have to live with what you've done." "This isn't about the wedding anymore," she snapped. "You've been undermining me from the start." "And how exactly did I do that, Sloane?" I asked, still not raising my voice. "Was it when I cooked for you every Sunday, even when you rolled your eyes at my dishes? Or when I offered you my mother's earrings and you said they weren't your vibe? Was it when I called you family before you ever earned it? I never asked you for those things." "No," I said, voice lowering, steel threading through. "You just took my time, my kindness, my silence." She didn't respond. "I built something with my husband from nothing," I continued. "We created a home, a business, a legacy. And you walked in, mistook all that for free real estate." "You're twisting everything," she said, but her voice cracked at the edge. "Am I?" I asked. "Or are you just hearing it without your usual applause?" The silence between us stretched. "I didn't mean for Evan to get hurt," she muttered. "But he did," I said. "And so did I. The difference is, he still has a chance to make it right." She hesitated. "And me?" I paused. Let the weight of that question settle. "You had your chance, Sloane. You used my name, my money, my memories, and when it didn't suit you, you told me I wasn't family." I reached for the teacup. It was still warm in my hand. "Well, now you're not mine either." I hung up, not in anger, just finality. Then I sat back and sipped the tea, faintly bitter. The crack in the cup caught the light, and for a moment it shimmered like gold. I didn't need to say a word. The unraveling did it for me. It started with Paige. She sent a message, polite but tight. "Hi, Joan. I've decided to step away from the coordination moving forward. Best of luck to the family." She didn't mention the chaos, but I knew it had begun. Vendors started dropping one by one, a domino line of whispered refusals. The floral shipment was the first to arrive and never leave. Dozens of imported white roses left wilting inside a delivery truck, their delicate petals bruised by the Florida heat. The driver paced the lot, phone pressed to his ear, waiting for an answer that never came. The string quartet canceled. Their polished instruments reboxed, sheet music tucked away as if it had never been rehearsed. The sound technician quietly pulled his cables from the ballroom walls, glancing at the bride's family who hovered helplessly nearby. And the ballroom, mine, stood cavernous and echoing. A few tables had already been dressed in linen, but no centerpieces came. No candles were lit. The chandeliers sparkled only for themselves. I watched from the corner window of the resort's top floor, hidden behind linen drapes. I'd once watched Martin welcome guests from this very window, waving as he adjusted his tie, proud of the home we built for strangers to feel special. Now, I watched a wedding collapse in real time. Sloane's voice carried faintly across the courtyard, sharp and clipped, as she tried to call vendors back. Her dress, all lace and drama, caught the breeze in ways that once might have been cinematic. Today, it looked like a costume worn too early, for a role longer hers. She didn't know how quickly word travels. Some intern at one of the vendors posted the change on a bridal planning forum. Nothing malicious, just confusion. Ballroom canceled 48 hours before ceremony. Client changed. Anyone know what's going on? Then a blog picked it up. Brides Unfiltered. By afternoon, there were threads on Reddit, tweets multiplying by the minute. Who cancels like this? $80,000 deposit down the drain? Bridezilla or something worse? They didn't name names, but the breadcrumbs were enough. Someone found a rehearsal dinner photo geo-tagged, then the registry. Then Sloane's Instagram went private. But by then, it was too late. I sat with a cup of tea and watched it all spiral, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. Downstairs, Evan was in the small business center we had built into the East Wing, where guests sometimes printed flight itineraries. He sat hunched over a table, my father's watch still strapped to his wrist. He used to run his fingers along its ridged edge when he was nervous. He was doing that now. In front of him, a folder of revised vendor contracts, revised budgets, emergency requests. He turned the pages like a man looking for a way out, then back again, then back again. I knew that rhythm. It wasn't indecision, it was grief in motion, the body's way of delaying the inevitable. I didn't interrupt him. He still didn't know about Rosa. The staff, bound by confidentiality, respected my silence. The ballroom had already been reassigned for tomorrow. It would host a different kind of wedding, one stitched by love, not entitlement. Meanwhile, Sloane paced outside, still in her robe, barking into her phone. She hadn't noticed the florist had stopped answering. She hadn't realized the violinist was already on a flight to Maine. She hadn't grasped that I didn't need to raise my voice to change the ending. All I had to do was step back and let her hear the silence. They say the sun always shines a little different on the day something real begins. That morning, Juniper Bay breathed slower, deeper. The air held a sweetness only found after a storm has passed. The ballroom, our ballroom, looked nothing like the glossy renderings from Sloane's Pinterest board. Instead of crystal chandeliers and imported orchids, there were garlands of wildflowers, freshly picked from the garden behind the staff dorms. They looped gently from one wooden beam to another, their colors soft and sun-kissed. The chairs were mismatched, repurposed from various wings of the resort, but they formed perfect rows. At the front, a simple arch made from driftwood stood anchored by jars of lavender and rosemary. And behind it all, the massive glass windows drank in the golden light, casting warm puddles on the polished floor. It didn't sparkle. It breathed. Guests were quiet at first, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to feel joy in a space that had so recently been reclaimed from grief. But then Maria walked in. She wore a pale lilac dress, the kind she'd never have worn while scrubbing tiles. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on her daughter, and they filled before a single word had been spoken. Rosa stood at the top of the aisle in a dress she'd sewn herself. No train, no corset, just soft cream fabric that hugged her like memory. She held a tiny bouquet of baby's breath, tied with a ribbon that looked eerily like one I'd given her once, decades ago. The violinist, an older man from town who played at the farmer's market, began a slow, wandering melody, the kind that made your chest feel too small. I sat in the very back row. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't need to be. In my hands was a small ceramic cup, the one with the blue cracked glaze. I hadn't brought it to make a point. It simply felt right to hold something that had once been broken and still held warmth. As Rosa took her first step, her dress swaying gently around her ankles, I felt something stir. Not regret, but memory. I saw Evan as a boy, running across that same courtyard, grass-stained and barefoot, his little hand wrapped around mine. His laughter once echoed through these halls the way Rosa's steps now did. Rosa moved down the aisle, her eyes fixed on the man waiting for her, humble, nervous, beautiful in his stillness. Each guest smiled as she passed. No judgment, no performance, just community. Somewhere behind me, a shift in the light pulled my attention. I turned my head slightly, and there he was, Evan, standing just outside the glass doors, half in shadow. He hadn't shaved. His collar was undone. His eyes, wide and hollow, locked on Rosa. He didn't try to enter. He didn't wave. He just stood. His shoulders rose and fell with a tremble I remembered from his childhood, when he'd try not to cry after scraping his knee but couldn't quite hold it in. He watched Rosa glide past where his wedding would have taken place, saw the guests lean forward, not for spectacle, but for reverence. Witnessed his mother sitting still, silent, not looking at him, not beckoning him. I could feel his question pressing against the glass. Why this? Why not mine? But I had no answer. Love can't be bought. Roots can't be forged in marble. And sometimes you don't realize what's hollow until you stand beside something whole. I let the silence speak. At the altar, Rosa turned to her groom. They didn't say anything elaborate. No memorized vows, no performative tears. Just this. With you, I begin again. He slipped the ring on her finger with hands that shook slightly. Her fingers steadied his. The applause was immediate, unapologetic. It rang through the space and spilled into the halls, louder than any speaker system Sloan could have rented. I saw Evan flinch, and then, slowly, he turned. His figure retreated through the doorway, swallowed by the afternoon sun. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look back. I held my cup tighter, its warmth fading gently into my palms. In front of me, Rosa's mother wept. Staff clapped. And outside, the sound of the sea returned. It was a different kind of music, one I hadn't heard in years. The morning after Rosa's wedding, I walked into the boardroom with a different kind of silence behind me, not the hollow quiet of exclusion, but the grounded stillness of clarity. The room, perched on the top floor of the East Wing, held 12 directors, 2 assistants, and the smell of overpriced espresso. Sunlight spilled through the glass wall behind me, casting long shadows that reached across the walnut table like fingers. I stood at the head without sitting. My Sheffer pen rested in my palm, closed. I didn't need to sign anything that day, but I came to draw a line. Effective immediately, I said, voice steady. Any future wedding hosted under Merrick Hospitality will require the addition of what I'm calling the dignity clause. Some raised their eyebrows. One coughed. In short, I continued, we will no longer host celebrations where the mother of the bride or groom is deliberately excluded without cause. It's not good for optics, and it's not good for the soul of this place. Ramon, head of business development, leaned forward. Joan, with respect, are we in the business of enforcing family dynamics? We've always been in the business of beginnings, I replied. We market hope, memory, redemption. You think people come here for the mints on the pillows? That quieted him. Catherine, the youngest director, looked hesitant. But how do we enforce it? We don't. We simply require couples to acknowledge it, a box to check, a statement to sign, one sentence, that they have not willfully excluded a parent, particularly a mother, without speaking to them first. Another voice chimed in. That's unprecedented. So was building an empire from a crumbling roof and a broken heater, I said, smiling just enough. So was surviving the man I loved. So was giving away an $80,000 ballroom to a girl who once cleaned gum off our tiles. They didn't laugh, but they listened. I'm not here to parent other people's children, I said more softly now, but I do set the rules for the house I built. And in this house, dignity comes first, not dollars. I let that settle. One by one, their gazes dropped, some to their notes, some to their phones, but not one argued again. Behind me, the sea winked under the rising sun. I clicked the pen open and drew a single line across the bottom of a proposal form. No signature needed, just a line, a boundary. No one cheered, no one clapped. But I walked out of that room straighter than I had in years. I wasn't there when it happened, but the walls of this town carry echoes. It was the night after the vendors pulled out. The ballroom had gone dark. The flowers never left the truck. My son came home to a woman, pacing in heels that cost more than my first kitchen remodel. "You knew," Evan said, holding the crumpled invoice in his hand. My name, my card, the resort header glaring back at him. Sloane didn't deny it. She was never the kind to. "She wasn't going to use it," she shrugged, brushing her fingers through her blown-out hair. "You think she cares?" "She has 100 rooms and a dozen spas. It's just one deposit," Evan's voice, I imagine, cracked somewhere under the weight of it. "You told me it was yours, that we could afford it because of your trust." I said, she snapped, "I handled it." Silence, and then she said it. "She's the past, Evan." He didn't scream. My son doesn't scream. But there's something louder in a whisper when the ground gives way. She's the roof we lived under when the wind tore the windows open. He dropped the paper on the table. She's the blanket that wrapped me after my first broken arm. She's the hands that clapped when no one else showed up. She is the reason I know how to breathe when I'm drowning. Sloane turned her back, grabbing her phone, scrolling, pretending it wasn't real. This again. "You're too attached, and you're not attached enough." Those might have been his last words in that room. She spun. "I'm not marrying your mother, Evan. I'm marrying you." He stared at her like seeing someone for the first time. "No," he said. "You were marrying the son of a woman you thought wouldn't speak." And then he walked. The door didn't slam because Evan doesn't slam things. He closes them like he doesn't want the world to notice he's leaving. Like if he's quiet enough, maybe someone will stop him. But Sloane didn't. She just stood there in that oversized condo, surrounded by registry gifts and rented centerpieces, and flung the engagement ring down onto the marble table with a hollow clink. I wasn't there, but I felt it. Somewhere across town, as I poured a cup of chamomile and watched the fog roll in, the steam curled against my cheek like a whisper, and I knew. It arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, just my name written in careful loops on the front of a pale blue envelope. I held it for a long time before opening it, like it might bite or sing. The handwriting was unmistakable. Still too perfect, the kind taught at private schools where no one sweats or bleeds. But there was something different in the way the ink wavered, like the tip of the pen had hesitated. "Joan, I've never written a real letter before. I didn't even know where to buy stamps. I moved out of the apartment 2 weeks ago. Evan and we're not speaking. I suppose you knew that before I did. I'm staying above a bakery in the lower district. The ceilings leak when it rains, and the walls smell like vanilla and yeast. I started helping out downstairs. First just washing bowls, then piping frosting, and now I'm learning how to make sourdough rise without screaming at it." I smiled despite myself. It's funny, I used to think old meant useless. But here, the best things take time. The longer the dough rests, the deeper the flavor. The more worn the pan, the better the crust. I've started to think maybe being old isn't about fading. Maybe it's about holding together longer than expected. There was a blot of ink, like a pause. "You once said I didn't understand what made something home. I do now. I won't ask for forgiveness. I wouldn't know what to do with it. But I hope you know, if I ever have a daughter and she ever decides to marry, I'll make sure she knows who taught me what love costs and what it's worth." Sloane. I sat with the letter in my lap for a while, hands still, tea cooling beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't sigh. Some feelings come not as waves, but as tides slowly pulling back, leaving behind polished stones. Eventually, I stood and crossed the room to the cabinet where I kept Martin's things. Inside, a small wooden box, his Sheffer pen, a hotel keycard from our very first inn, and a faded napkin where he once scribbled, "Let's make this a place people come to begin." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it beneath the napkin, not as a keepsake, not as closure, but as thread, a seam. Sometimes we don't patch the fabric. We just leave the tear and trust the gold thread of memory to run through it. I poured myself a new cup of tea. As I lifted the porcelain mug to my lips, light from the late afternoon sun passed through the window and caught the hairline crack along the handle. For a moment, that tiny fracture shimmered like a golden thread, as if the light had sewn it shut. And I thought, maybe some things don't break. Maybe they just change shape. It was a Thursday morning when Evan showed up at my door. He stood there like a boy again, one hand gripping the strap of his old college backpack, the other holding a medium-sized terracotta pot. Inside it was a rosemary bush, compact but lush, the green needles catching the soft light of the morning sun. "I heard," he said, voice low. "Rosemary does well in bright light. Like you." I didn't speak for a moment. I stepped aside and let him in. He followed me to the kitchen and set the pot gently on the windowsill. The rosemary stood tall, quiet, resilient. "Smells like old dinners and new beginnings," he said, half laughing. I reached out, brushed my fingers along the fragrant leaves, then brought them to my nose. "Rosemary doesn't need to shout to be known," I said quietly. "It just needs someone not to pull it out by the roots." He looked down, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry, Mom." That was all, but it was enough to let the warmth begin again. A few days later, I went to Juniper Bay. The air smelled of salt and hibiscus, and the tiles still creaked in the same spots they always had. Near the side entrance, where guests rarely wandered, stood a large chalkboard. Someone had drawn delicate vines around the edges, and in the center, 3 sentences, written in Evan's handwriting, unmistakable in its slanted, boyish tilt. 1. No mother stands outside the door. 2. No staff is background. 3. If it's just a vibe, the vibe pays its own bill. I stood there a long while, reading, rereading. Each word was a stitch, mending something torn. I didn't cry. I just nodded, once, and walked inside. It was a modest room decorated with paper streamers and folding chairs. A large pitcher of lemonade sat sweating on a plastic table. Someone had brought cookies, store-bought but arranged with care. We were celebrating the first graduating class of Merrick Hospitality's Employee English program. 10 people stood at the front of the room, holding printed certificates, some upside down. There was laughter, awkwardness, and pride. So much pride. Maria stood beside her daughter Rosa, now a married woman, now wearing a name badge that read, Guest Services Coordinator. She cleared her throat and stepped forward. "I try speak," she said, eyes darting to the paper in her hand. "My English, slow, but thank you for seeing us." The room went silent. Then someone clapped. Then everyone did. And I looked around. This, I thought, was what we meant to build. That night, I opened the wooden box again. The Sheffer pen lay where I'd left it, the napkin with Martin's words. Beneath them all, folded neatly, was the handwritten will I hadn't touched in years. I unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded just slightly, but Martin's blocky, deliberate handwriting was still legible. To Joan. This place belongs to you, always. Make it a place where people begin again. I smiled. I didn't need a courtroom or a fight to feel his presence. His legacy wasn't the money or the buildings or even the name. It was this feeling that we could always start again, even when things cracked, even when we did. I folded the paper again and placed it beside my teacup, the same one with the hairline fracture along the handle. When the light hit just right, the crack glowed, like something precious mended, not broken. A few weeks passed. Then came the postcard. The front showed a lemon tart, golden and glossy, with a small fork pressed into its center. On the back, written in Sloane's handwriting, If someday you want to taste something I made with both hands, you know where to find me. There was no address, no return name, just that one sentence. I didn't write back. Instead, I placed the card inside Martin's journal next to his sketch of the lobby chandelier and a coffee-stained list of room numbers that needed repainting. Some things you answer not with words but with space. Some things grow quietly without being watered every day. That afternoon, as I sat in my chair with the breeze slipping through the curtains, I lifted my teacup again. The light was just right. The crack along the handle caught it, glinting like a gold thread stitched across porcelain. No one had fixed it, but somehow it held, and that was enough. The tea had long cooled in my cup, but I still held it between my palms. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sun no longer pushes but lingers, resting gently on everything it touches, on the clay pot of rosemary by the window, on the papers spread across my table, and on the small mirror mounted above the sideboard. I glanced toward it, and there, in the reflection, were 3 faces. Martin's first. Caught in a photo I had propped beside the teapot. He wore his old straw hat, the one fraying at the edge. He was laughing, eyes crinkled at the corners like always. The kind of laughter that didn't need a punchline. Next to him, my own reflection. The light hit my face in a way that softened the lines. My eyes looked brighter than I remembered. Maybe that was just the angle, or maybe it was something else. And behind me, barely within the frame, was Evan. He hadn't spoken yet. He stood still like someone unsure if they were allowed into the memory, but he was there, closer now than he had been in years. I looked down at my teacup. The crack along the handle, the one I used to hide when guests came over, now shimmered faintly. In the late sunlight, it looked almost golden, like a thread pulled tight to hold everything together. Funny how long I'd spent fearing broken things. Turns out they held the most truth. I took a slow sip, not for warmth, it had gone tepid, but for memory. Then I whispered, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. Tomorrow, I'll still choose peace. I didn't need the world to change for me to feel whole. I just needed to stop asking it to explain itself. Outside, Juniper Bay glowed softly. String lights blinked above the veranda. Somewhere, someone was laughing. One of the staff, probably, their voices mingling with the clink of glasses and the shuffle of chairs being set up for tomorrow's brunch. No wedding, no grand event, just people gathering. Starting again. And here I was, still standing. Before we say goodbye, I wonder, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee in your hands, like mine? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company when the world is hushed and the heart is loud? Wherever you are, I hope you'll let us know in the comments. I read everyone with quiet gratitude. And if this story touched something in you, I hope you'll subscribe, not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for sitting with me, even if just for a while. And if you carry anything from my story, let it be this. The miracle doesn't always knock on your door. Sometimes it waits just outside, patient and quiet, until your heart is ready to open again. Take care. We'll meet again somewhere in the next story.